The dense mountain fog hides secrets that most people never want to find. Caden was an active-duty Navy SEAL looking for peace. He came to the Cascade Mountains to escape the echoes of war. But when his loyal German shepherd, Brutus, caught a scent in the freezing woods, his peaceful vacation turned into a deadly hunt. Tied to an ancient oak tree, bleeding out in the mud, was a female police officer. She was lured into a brutal trap, and the heavily armed mercenaries who put her there were still hiding in the mist, waiting to finish the job. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from, and if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. The dense fog rolled through the Cascade Mountains like a slow gray river. It swallowed the towering pine trees and erased the winding dirt trail ahead. Caden adjusted the heavy canvas straps of his tactical backpack. He breathed in the freezing damp air. The sharp scent of wet earth, decaying leaves, and pine needles filled his lungs. For the first time in 10 months, nobody was shooting at him. No sirens wailed in the distance. No explosive charges rattled the ground beneath his boots. Caden was an active-duty Navy SEAL. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders and cold gray eyes that constantly scanned his surroundings out of pure habit. His face bore the subtle scars of close-quarters combat, lines carved by the harsh sun of the Middle East and the harsher realities of his profession. He desperately needed this leave. He needed the absolute silence of the Washington wilderness to wash away the echoes of gunfire and the faces of the men he could not save. He did not walk this isolated trail alone. A few paces ahead, a large German shepherd trotted with focused purpose. This was Brutus. The dog had a thick, waterproof coat of black and tan fur and ears that stood at constant, sharp attention. Brutus was not an official military working dog, but Caden trained him with the exact same rigorous discipline. They shared a profound bond built on silent hand commands, shared meals, and absolute trust. When Caden stopped walking, Brutus stopped instantly. When Caden moved, the dog confidently took the lead. The mountain trail grew progressively steeper as the morning dragged on. Slippery rocks, hidden mud patches, and exposed tree roots made every single step treacherous. Caden moved with the practiced, deliberate grace of a man highly comfortable in hostile and unforgiving environments. Brutus moved effortlessly, navigating the terrain like a wild wolf returning to his ancestral home. The silence between the man and the dog was comfortable. It was a shared understanding that spoken words were useless out here in the wild. They hiked for another 2 solid hours. The elevation climbed steadily, and the temperature dropped several degrees. The fog thickened into a heavy, suffocating blanket that limited visibility to less than 30 feet. The normal, comforting sounds of the forest slowly faded away. The chirping mountain birds and rustling ground squirrels vanished entirely. A heavy, unnatural quiet settled over the damp woods. Caden felt a familiar, cold prickle at the base of his neck. It was the exact same survival instinct that kept him alive in urban war zones and dangerous desert night raids. Something felt fundamentally wrong about this section of the mountain. He reached down and quietly unclipped the safety strap on his molded holster. He carried a compact 9mm pistol on his right hip, purely out of habit. Out here, the standard threat was usually a stray black bear or a hungry mountain lion. Today, the air felt different. It felt heavy with malice. Suddenly, Brutus stopped abruptly. The massive dog froze dead in his tracks. His ears swiveled aggressively forward, locking onto a faint sound that Caden's human ears could not detect. The coarse hair along the back of Brutus's neck stood straight up. A low, guttural growl started deep within the dog's broad chest. It was a clear, unmistakable warning sound. Caden immediately dropped to one knee in the wet dirt. He placed a steadying, gloved hand on the dog's tense back. "What is it, boy?" Caden whispered into the fog. Brutus did not look back at his master. He kept his intense gaze locked on a thick cluster of tall green ferns to their immediate left. The main hiking trail continued straight up the ridge, but Brutus clearly wanted to go off the established path. There was an old, rusted metal sign nailed to a rotting tree near the edge of the ferns. The faded, peeling red letters read, "Restricted Area. No camping." Brutus barked. It was not a playful yip asking for a toy. It was a loud, sharp, aggressively defensive command. The dog lunged forward, violently pushing his way through the wet ferns. Caden did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He drew his weapon, holding it close to his chest, and followed the dog into the brush. The underbrush was incredibly thick and thorny. Wet branches slapped painfully against Caden's tactical jacket and scraped his face. The ground in this restricted zone was horribly uneven, covered in deep, sucking mud and hidden sinkholes covered by dead leaves. He tracked Brutus strictly by the sound of snapping twigs and the dog's occasional angry barks. They moved rapidly down a dangerously steep ravine, sliding on patches of wet moss. The fog was thickest down here, pooling heavily at the bottom of the gorge like thick gray smoke. Caden finally broke through the dense tree line and stepped into a small, ruined clearing. It looked exactly like an old logging camp that had been left to rot decades ago. Broken wooden shipping crates and rusted metal chemical barrels littered the muddy, uneven ground. Brutus stood right in the center of the clearing, barking furiously at a massive, ancient oak tree. Caden moved forward using smooth, tactical steps, keeping his gun raised and his eyes scanning the tree line for movement. His heavy boots sank deep into the foul-smelling mud. He squinted hard through the gray haze, trying to make out what the dog had found. A human figure was slumped heavily against the wide base of the oak tree. Caden lowered his weapon slightly and sprinted forward, abandoning his cautious approach. As he got closer, the brutal, violent reality of the scene hit him hard in the chest. It was a woman. She was bound tightly to the thick trunk of the tree, with heavy-duty, black nylon zip ties securing her wrists and ankles. Her head hung forward limply, her chin resting against her chest. She wore a tan law enforcement uniform, now stained dark with sweat, dirt, and rainwater. A shiny silver badge was securely pinned to her chest. She was a police officer. Caden slid into the mud right beside her. Her uniform was violently torn in multiple places. Deep, dark red blood soaked her left shoulder completely and heavily stained the right leg of her tactical pants. Her face was incredibly pale, smeared with forest dirt and dried blood. She looked completely lifeless. Brutus immediately stopped barking and gently nudged her limp leg with his wet nose, whining softly in distress. Caden holstered his weapon without looking down. He reached out and pressed his 2 index fingers firmly against the side of her cold neck. He held his breath, closing his eyes and waiting for the absolute worst. A faint, highly erratic pulse fluttered weakly against his fingertips. She was alive, but she was bleeding out and barely holding on. Caden looked up and scanned the silent, foggy clearing once more. Whoever did this brutal thing could still be out there right now, watching them from the deep shadows of the pines. His peaceful mountain vacation was officially over. The war had just followed him into the woods. Caden knelt in the freezing mud. He kept his eyes locked on the injured woman. He reached for the heavy tactical knife strapped to his chest rig. The black steel blade slid out of the sheath with a soft metallic scrape. He grabbed the thick nylon zip ties, biting deeply into her pale wrists. He angled the sharp blade carefully and sliced through the tough plastic. Her arms dropped heavily to her sides, lifeless and limp. He moved quickly down to her boots and cut the restraints around her ankles. He rolled her gently onto her uninjured right side. He needed to assess the massive blood loss immediately. He pulled a small, high-powered tactical flashlight from his utility pocket. The bright white beam cut sharply through the thick gray fog. He illuminated the brass nameplate pinned to her torn uniform shirt. It read, S. Jenkins, Deputy Sheriff. Caden worked rapidly. His hands moved with the mechanical precision of a seasoned combat medic. He unzipped his waterproof backpack and pulled out his trauma kit. He tore open a sterile pressure dressing with his teeth, spitting the plastic wrapper into the mud. The primary wound was a deep, jagged puncture on her left shoulder. It looked exactly like a high-caliber bullet entry wound. The fabric of her shirt was soaked through. He pressed the thick white gauze directly into the bleeding hole. He pushed down hard, applying maximum physical pressure to stop the arterial flow. Jenkins groaned loudly. Her eyelids fluttered open. Her brown eyes were unfocused, glassy with severe shock and immense physical pain. "Stay with me, Deputy," Caden commanded softly. His voice remained calm and steady. It was the exact voice he used to keep young sailors alive in burning vehicles overseas. "My name is Caden. I am a Navy medic. You are safe right now. Keep your eyes open and look at me." She gasped for cold air. Her chest heaved violently under the heavy uniform. She tried to lift her muddy hands, but her physical strength was completely gone. They are still here," she whispered. Her voice barely carried over, the rustling wind moving through the tall pines. Caden applied more body weight onto her shoulder wound. He leaned down, placing his ear close to her pale lips. "Who is here? Who did this to you?" "The cartel," she choked out. "An ambush. They took my radio. They took my service weapon. They tied me up to die in the cold." "How many shooters?" Caden asked. He kept his tone strictly professional. 5, maybe 6 heavily armed men. They have heavy weapons. Night vision goggles. She coughed violently, spitting a small amount of dark blood onto her chin. "They are hunting me." Caden nodded slowly. He did not show any outward signs of fear. Panic always got people killed in combat. He pulled a secondary elastic dressing from his kit and wrapped it securely over the first gauze layer. He pulled the bandage tight, locking the pressure pad into place. The bleeding slowed down significantly, but her core body temperature was dropping dangerously fast. The cold mountain mud drained the heat right out of her bones. Her lips were turning a faint shade of blue. He quickly took off his heavy tactical jacket. He draped the thick garment carefully over her shivering body, tucking the edges firmly under her sides to trap her remaining body heat. He wore only a thin, dark green tactical shirt underneath, but he actively ignored the biting cold air against his own skin. "I need to call for an emergency medevac," Caden stated. He reached into his cargo pants pocket and pulled out his encrypted satellite phone. He flipped the screen open and waited. He stared at the blinking red indicator light on the top corner. 0 signal. The dense fog and the towering rock walls of the deep ravine completely blocked the satellite connection. They were completely cut off from the outside world. No backup was coming. "No signal," Caden muttered. He securely tucked the phone back into his pocket. Jenkins grabbed his wrist with surprising desperation. Her cold fingers dug into his skin. "Leave me," she pleaded. "You cannot fight a heavily armed squad alone. They will kill you. Take your dog and run." Caden looked directly down at her. He placed his large, calloused hand over her trembling fingers. "I do not leave people behind, Deputy. That is not how I operate. We are getting out of this forest together. That is a promise." He reached into his medical pack again and retrieved a small silver foil emergency blanket. He unfolded it and wrapped it tightly around her legs. He needed to elevate her feet to keep the blood flowing to her vital organs. He shoved his sturdy waterproof backpack directly under her boots. Brutus paced nervously around the perimeter of the small dirt clearing. The large dog kept his nose low to the ground, sniffing the damp earth for fresh tracks. He did not like this isolated place. The metallic scent of human blood and aggressive men lingered heavily in the damp air. Caden finished securing the last bandage. He checked her pulse one more time against her neck. It beat slightly stronger, but she desperately needed a trauma hospital. Blood transfusions and immediate surgery were the only things that would keep her alive until morning. He mentally calculated the exact distance back to the main highway. It was at least a 3-hour hike over treacherous, rocky terrain, and he had to carry a wounded woman the entire way. "We need to move now," Caden told her. "This clearing is an obvious trap. If they come back to check on your body, we are sitting ducks." Jenkins nodded weakly. "My legs are completely numb. I cannot walk." "I will carry you," Caden replied. He stood up and stretched his back muscles. He mentally prepared himself for the grueling physical exertion ahead. He checked the safety on his pistol one more time. Before Caden could bend down to lift her off the ground, Brutus stopped pacing. The German shepherd planted his front paws firmly in the mud. He lowered his massive head. A deep, rumbling growl vibrated loudly in his throat. He stared intensely into the thick wall of gray fog directly ahead of them. Caden froze in place. Every muscle in his body tensed. He slowly lowered his right hand to the grip of his 9mm pistol. He did not draw the weapon yet, but his thumb rested firmly on the safety switch. The forest went dead silent. The wind stopped blowing entirely. The fog seemed to thicken, swallowing the tall pine trees completely. Then, Caden heard it clearly. A sharp, distinct sound cut through the heavy silence. It was the unmistakable crack of a heavy combat boot stepping aggressively on a dry branch. The loud sound came from the dense brush just beyond the tree line, less than 50 yards away. Brutus bared his sharp white teeth. The thick hair along his back stood up like iron needles. He barked once, a short and highly aggressive warning. "Quiet," Caden hissed softly. He gave a sharp downward hand signal. Brutus immediately fell silent, but he did not break his aggressive combat stance. Another heavy footstep echoed in the fog, then another. They were slow, methodical, and deliberate. Someone was approaching the hidden clearing, and they carried weapons. Caden looked down at Jenkins. Her eyes widened with pure terror. She knew exactly who was stepping out of the mist. Caden did not waste a single second. The approaching footsteps sounded heavy and deliberate. They were less than 40 yards away and closing fast. He grabbed the thick nylon straps of his tactical backpack. He hoisted it onto his chest, securing it tightly. He needed his back completely free. "Put your arms around my neck," Caden whispered. Jenkins groaned in pain. She weakly lifted her muddy arms. Caden crouched low into the freezing mud. He wrapped his strong arms firmly around her legs and stood up in one smooth, powerful motion. The sudden movement sent a sharp wave of agony through Jenkins. She bit her lip hard to stop herself from screaming. She weighed around 140 pounds, but dead weight always felt significantly heavier. "Brutus, point," Caden commanded softly. The German shepherd understood instantly. The dog abandoned his defensive stance. He turned his back to the approaching threat and sprinted silently into the thickest part of the forest. Caden followed right behind him. He moved with a highly practiced, tactical gait. He placed each step carefully, rolling from heel to toe to minimize the sound of breaking twigs. He actively avoided patches of soft mud to leave no clear boot prints. Carrying a wounded officer severely limited his speed, but his stamina was built for grueling conditions. The dense fog swallowed them whole within seconds. They pushed deeper into the Cascade wilderness. The terrain grew harsher. Jagged rocks and slippery pine needles covered the steep incline. Caden focused solely on his breathing. In, 2, 3, out, 2, 3. He ignored the burning sensation in his thigh muscles. He ignored the warm blood slowly seeping through Jenkins' bandages and soaking into his green tactical shirt. They hiked aggressively for 20 grueling minutes. Caden finally spotted a massive, uprooted pine tree resting at an angle against a rock wall. It provided excellent natural cover. He moved behind the thick roots and gently lowered Jenkins to the cold ground. She gasped for air. Her face looked completely drained of color. Caden immediately checked her bandages. The secondary dressing held firm, but she desperately needed water and heat. He pulled a heavy steel canteen from his chest rig. He unscrewed the cap and held it to her lips. "Drink slowly," Caden ordered. Jenkins took 2 small sips. She coughed, wiping water from her chin. Her eyes looked slightly more focused now. The adrenaline of the escape temporarily fought off the freezing shock. "You move like a ghost," she whispered, leaning her head against the rough bark. "It is my job," Caden replied. He kept his eyes scanning the fog above them. "Tell me exactly what we are dealing with. Why did a cartel squad ambush a local deputy?" Jenkins took a deep, shaky breath. I was working a quiet investigation. We noticed a surge in high-end military weapons flooding the local streets. No serial numbers. Pristine condition. I tracked the transport route to an old logging road a few miles from here. Caden listened closely. He memorized every detail. "Did you find the drop point?" "Yes." Jenkins nodded weakly. "They use the abandoned ranger stations in these mountains to store the crates before moving them out of state. I found a massive cache of assault rifles and explosives. I was taking photos for evidence. I never even heard them approach. Someone hit me hard from behind. When I woke up, I was tied to that oak tree. They told me they were going to make an example out of me." "They made a fatal mistake leaving you alive," Caden stated flatly. "They are not regular street thugs," Jenkins warned him. Her voice shook with genuine fear. "They moved with absolute precision. They did not speak much. They communicated with tactical hand signals. They carry specialized gear. Night vision. Body armor. They looked like private military contractors." Caden frowned. That completely changed the tactical situation. If they were dealing with trained mercenaries, standard evasion tactics would not work for long. Mercenaries knew how to track. They knew how to hunt. Brutus suddenly whined softly. The large dog paced back and forth near the edge of the uprooted tree. He sniffed the damp air aggressively. Caden stood up slowly. He unholstered his 9mm pistol. He checked the chamber purely by touch. "What is wrong?" Jenkins asked softly. "They found our trail," Caden whispered back. A strange, rhythmic beeping sound echoed faintly through the fog. It sounded synthetic and highly unnatural in the wild forest. Caden recognized the noise instantly. It was a military-grade GPS tracking receiver. "Did you have a radio on you when they took you?" Caden asked quickly. "Yes, a standard-issue police radio." "They took it," Jenkins replied, her eyes widening in sudden realization. "They are not tracking your radio," Caden said grimly. "They are tracking your badge. Some departments install micro-trackers inside the badges for officer safety." Jenkins reached up weakly with her good hand and grabbed the silver badge pinned to her torn shirt. She tried to rip it off, but her fingers lacked the necessary strength. "Let me," Caden said. He reached down and firmly ripped the heavy metal badge from her uniform. He threw it hard into the thick brush about 30 yards away to their right. It was too late. The loud, deafening crack of a high-powered rifle shattered the quiet mountain air. A heavy-caliber bullet violently struck the trunk of the uprooted pine tree right above Caden's head. Thick chunks of bark and sharp splinters exploded outward like shrapnel. Caden instinctively threw his body over Jenkins, shielding her face from the flying wood. 3 more shots rang out in rapid succession. The bullets tore through the dense ferns and snapped tree branches all around them. The shooters were firing blindly into the fog, using the tracker's last known location to suppress the area. Brutus barked furiously, ready to charge into the mist. "No, Brutus! Stay!" Caden yelled over the gunfire. He grabbed Jenkins by her tactical belt and dragged her forcefully behind the thickest part of the root system. The heavy rifle fire continued, systematically shredding the vegetation just a few feet away. The mercenaries were executing a perfect bounding overwatch maneuver. One group fired to keep them pinned down, while the other group moved closer. "We cannot stay here," Jenkins yelled over the noise. "I know," Caden replied coldly. His eyes locked onto a narrow, rocky path leading further up the steep mountain face. It was completely exposed, but it was their only viable exit. He holstered his pistol and crouched low. "Hold on tight." Caden hauled her onto his back once more. He did not care about leaving tracks anymore. He only cared about speed and survival. The hunt had escalated into an all-out war. The climb up the rocky path tested the absolute limits of Caden's endurance. The steep incline was brutal and unforgiving. Loose gravel slipped beneath his boots with every single step, threatening to send them both tumbling down the mountain. He carried Jenkins high on his back, adjusting her dead weight constantly to keep his center of gravity forward. The heavy fog clung to them like a wet, freezing blanket, soaking through his thin tactical shirt. Gunfire echoed from the deep valley below, but it sounded slightly more distant now. The mercenary squad was currently searching the lower tree line, trying desperately to locate their missing target. Caden pushed his burning legs harder. His lungs demanded more oxygen in the thin mountain air. He desperately needed a defensible position to regroup. He constantly scanned the sheer rock face to his immediate left. A dark shadow broke the solid gray stone structure. It was a narrow, jagged fissure, hidden perfectly behind a thick cluster of dead pine branches. "Hold on," Caden whispered over his shoulder. He turned his body sideways and squeezed carefully through the tight opening. The narrow fissure opened up into a small, dry, natural cave. The air inside felt slightly warmer, protected entirely from the biting mountain wind. Caden knelt carefully and lowered Jenkins to the hard, dusty stone floor. She groaned softly. Her pale eyelids remained closed. The severe blood loss and the extreme cold were taking a massive physical toll on her body. Caden pulled his heavy tactical jacket tighter around her shivering shoulders. He checked her bandages again in the dim, gray light filtering through the entrance. The bleeding remained controlled under the tight pressure dressing, but her pulse felt terribly weak against his fingers. Brutus squeezed into the small cave right behind them. The large dog vigorously shook the cold rainwater from his thick fur. He walked straight over to Jenkins and laid his massive body directly against her uninjured side. The dog offered his natural, radiating body heat to keep the dying officer warm. Caden knelt down in front of the dog. He grabbed Brutus firmly by the collar and looked directly into his highly intelligent brown eyes. "Guard," Caden commanded in a firm, low tone. "You stay right here. Do not make a single sound." Brutus let out a very low, nearly silent rumble of strict acknowledgement in his chest. The loyal dog placed his heavy chin on his front paws, keeping his sharp eyes locked directly on the cave entrance. Caden stood up quickly. He left his heavy waterproof backpack on the cave floor. He needed to be incredibly light. He needed to be blindingly fast. He drew his black combat knife and checked the sharp steel edge with his thumb. He pulled a long coil of olive-green parachute cord from his cargo pocket. He checked his 9mm pistol one last time. He had exactly 15 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. It was nowhere near enough firepower to take on a fully armed professional squad. He stepped back out into the freezing, thick fog. The fundamental rules of engagement had completely changed in the last 10 minutes. He was no longer running away. He was a highly trained Navy SEAL operating on his own rugged territory. It was time to aggressively shift the tactical dynamic. He mentally transitioned from hunted prey to apex predator. Caden moved swiftly down the rocky path, carefully retracing his own muddy footprints. He found a perfect natural choke point about 200 yards below the hidden cave. The rocky path narrowed drastically between 2 massive, moss-covered boulders. Anyone following their specific trail had to walk exactly through this very tight gap. He went to work immediately. He tied one end of the tough parachute cord to a sturdy, exposed tree root at the base of the left boulder. He pulled the strong cord perfectly taut, stretching it completely across the narrow path at ankle height. He secured the other end tightly to a heavy, immovable rock on the right side. He grabbed a handful of wet mud and rubbed it thoroughly over the bright green cord, making it completely invisible in the thick gray mist. Caden then climbed quickly and silently up the right boulder. He found a heavy, jagged piece of loose slate resting near the top. He positioned it precariously on the absolute edge of the boulder, directly above the hidden tripwire. He climbed back down the rock face and vanished completely into the thick brush a few yards away. He waited in absolute deadly silence. He actively controlled his breathing, intentionally slowing his heart rate down. The freezing mountain rain started to fall again, masking any small accidental sounds he might make in the brush. 10 long minutes passed slowly. Then he heard them approach. 2 distinct sets of heavy tactical boots crunched softly on the loose gravel path. Caden peered carefully through the wet green leaves. Two armed men emerged slowly from the dense fog. They moved with highly disciplined, professional tactical spacing. The lead man was tall and lean. He wore a dark gray combat uniform and a high-cut ballistic helmet. Expensive four-tube night vision goggles sat flipped up on his helmet mount. He held a customized assault rifle tight to his shoulder, scanning the path ahead. The second man was shorter and heavily muscled. He wore identical high-end gear and kept his weapon pointed at the steep ridge above them, covering their flank. These were definitely not amateur cartel thugs. They moved with the terrifying, calculated precision of seasoned combat veterans. The tall man suddenly raised his left hand in a closed fist. The short man stopped walking instantly. The tall man pointed two fingers directly at the muddy ground, indicating he found a fresh footprint. They were successfully tracking Caden's heavy boots up the mountain. The tall man stepped forward again, moving straight toward the narrow gap between the boulders. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the ground tracks. His heavy combat boots snagged the hidden, mud-covered parachute cord. The tough cord snapped tight instantly. The tall man stumbled hard, losing his balance completely. He fell violently forward onto the sharp rocks. His heavy rifle clattered loudly against the stone path. The sudden, violent tension on the cord easily dislodged the heavy slate from the boulder above. The jagged rock fell fast and smashed directly onto the fallen man's shoulder. He cried out in sudden, sharp pain. The short man reacted instantly to the ambush. He spun around, aggressively raising his rifle toward the boulder. Caden did not give him a fraction of a second to pull the trigger. He launched himself from the thick brush like an uncoiled steel spring. He crossed the short distance in two massive explosive strides. He grabbed the hot barrel of the short man's rifle with his left hand, violently shoving it upward toward the sky. The weapon fired a single, suppressed round harmlessly into the falling rain. Caden drove the heavy steel pommel of his combat knife brutally into the side of the man's ballistic helmet. The sickening, loud crack of heavy impact echoed sharply off the wet rocks. The short man's eyes rolled completely back into his head, and he collapsed instantly into the mud like a dropped stone. The tall man struggled desperately to get up, reaching frantically for his holstered sidearm. Caden pivoted smoothly on his heel. He kicked the man square in the chest with a heavy combat boot, driving him violently back down against the hard rocks. Caden dropped his heavy knee directly onto the man's sternum, pinning him completely to the ground. He pressed the cold, sharp steel blade of his combat knife directly against the man's exposed throat. The mercenary froze completely. His eyes widened in absolute shock and terror. Caden did not ask him any tactical questions. He struck the man hard behind the ear with the heavy handle of his knife. The man went entirely limp in the mud. Caden stood up quickly, breathing heavy from the sudden burst of extreme violence. He scanned the fog intensely for any other immediate threats. Heavy silence returned to the cold mountain. He grabbed both men firmly by their tactical vests and dragged their unconscious bodies deep into the thick ferns, completely hiding them from the main path. He knelt down quickly to inspect his new military assets. He picked up the dropped assault rifle from the mud. His eyes narrowed sharply. It was a highly modified Mk-18 carbine. It featured a premium holographic combat sight, an infrared laser aiming module, and a custom sound suppressor. The specialized weapon alone cost several thousands of dollars. He quickly checked the short man's tactical gear. He found extra magazines filled entirely with armor-piercing rounds, 2 fragmentation grenades, and a heavy-duty encrypted radio. Caden slung the heavy Mk-18 securely over his shoulder. He strapped the extra loaded magazines directly to his chest rig. The overall situation was incredibly dire, but the combat odds were slowly starting to shift in his favor. He was no longer unarmed against a vastly superior military force. He looked directly down at the encrypted radio. A small, bright green light blinked steadily on the top dial. Caden reached down and unclipped the radio from the unconscious man's vest. It was finally time to find out exactly who was hunting them in the dark. Caden moved like a shadow through the thick gray fog. He carried the captured heavy Mk-18 rifle firmly in his right hand. The encrypted military radio rested securely in his left hand. The small green light on the radio dial blinked steadily, a tiny beacon in the endless mist. He retraced his steps carefully up the steep, rocky path. He avoided the loose gravel and kept his breathing low and tightly controlled. He reached the hidden rock fissure. He squeezed his broad shoulders through the narrow opening and stepped back into the dry cave. The dim light revealed a comforting sight. Brutus still lay firmly against Deputy Sarah Jenkins. The large German shepherd kept her warm with his radiating body heat. The dog lifted his heavy head and thumped his tail once against the hard stone floor when Caden entered. "Good boy," Caden whispered. He knelt beside Jenkins. She looked slightly better. A tiny amount of color slowly returned to her pale cheeks. She opened her brown eyes and looked at the heavy combat rifle slung over his shoulder. "You found them," Jenkins said quietly. Her voice sounded much stronger than before. "2 scouts," Caden replied. He unclipped the extra magazines and the 2 fragmentation grenades from his chest rig. He laid the weapons carefully on the dusty cave floor. They were highly trained mercenaries. They had top-tier gear, night vision, suppressed weapons, armor-piercing rounds. But they made a critical mistake. They followed my trail exactly where I wanted them to go. Jenkins stared at the lethal hardware. "You took out 2 armed mercenaries with just a knife?" "I had the element of surprise," Caden stated flatly. He did not brag. It was simply a tactical fact. "And now we have their radio." He set the black radio down between them. He turned the volume knob very low. He did not want the sound echoing out of the cave. Static hissed softly from the small speaker. Then, a sharp, cold voice cut through the white noise. "Bravo 1, this is Alpha. Report your status." Caden and Jenkins leaned in close. Caden recognized the crisp, disciplined tone instantly. It was standard military communication. "Bravo 1 is not answering," Caden whispered, "because Bravo 1 is currently sleeping in the mud." The radio hissed again. "Bravo 1, respond immediately. You are missing your check-in." "They know something went wrong," Caden said. He checked the action on the captured Mk-18 rifle. He chambered a round with a soft metallic click. "They will change their search pattern now. They will stop looking for a wounded officer and start looking for a real threat." Jenkins looked directly at Caden. Her eyes held a mixture of fear and deep respect. "Who are you, Caden? Really?" Caden paused. He looked away from the radio and met her gaze. "I am a chief petty officer in the United States Navy. I operate with the SEAL teams. I came to these mountains to get away from the war. I guess the war had other plans." "I am sorry," Jenkins said sincerely. "You should not be involved in this mess. You could have just walked away." "I lost men," Caden replied slowly. The words felt heavy in his mouth. "Good men. I watched them die in the desert because backup did not arrive in time. I made a promise to myself. I will never leave a good person behind to die alone. Not ever again." Jenkins nodded slowly. She understood that kind of deep, internal pain. "I joined the force because of my father. He was a good cop. He always told me that a badge does not make you a hero. The choices you make when nobody is watching make you a hero. He died on duty 10 years ago. I just wanted to finish his work." "You are doing exactly that," Caden told her firmly. "You tracked a massive cartel weapon smuggling ring completely on your own. That takes serious guts." The radio crackled loudly, interrupting their quiet moment. A new voice came over the encrypted channel. This voice did not sound like the cold, disciplined mercenaries. It sounded older, rougher, and heavily strained with anger. "Alpha, this is command. What is the delay? I pay you people a fortune to handle simple problems. Find the girl and finish the job." Jenkins froze completely. Her breath hitched tightly in her throat. Her eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing horror. Caden noticed her sudden panic. "What is it? Do you know that voice?" Jenkins reached out with a trembling hand. She grabbed Caden's wrist. Her cold fingers dug painfully into his skin. "That voice," she whispered. Her voice shook violently. "I know that voice." "Who is it?" Caden demanded softly. He leaned closer to her. The radio hissed again. The angry voice returned. "Listen to me very carefully, Alpha. She cannot leave this mountain alive. If she gets to a phone, we are all dead. Lock down the main highway. Burn the entire forest down if you have to. Just bring me her badge." Tears welled up in Jenkins' eyes. The ultimate betrayal crashed down on her chest like a physical blow. The man coordinating the hit squad was not a random cartel boss. "That is Captain Miller," Jenkins choked out, staring blankly at the black radio. "He is my commanding officer at the station. He is the man who trained me." Caden's jaw tightened. The pieces of the puzzle violently snapped together. The mercenaries knew exactly where she was because her own captain sold her out. Miller used her hidden badge tracker to guide the hit squad right to her exact location. "He is the one running the weapons," Jenkins said. A single tear rolled down her dirty cheek. "He set me up. We cannot call the local police, Caden. We cannot trust anyone." Caden picked up the radio. He stared at the blinking green light. The situation just got infinitely worse. They were not just fighting mercenaries anymore. They were fighting the local law enforcement system. "We do not need the police," Caden said. His voice turned ice cold. He picked up the heavy combat rifle and checked the loaded magazine. "We will handle this ourselves." Caden strapped the captured military radio securely to his heavy tactical vest. The small green light blinked steadily in the dim cave, but the encrypted channel remained completely silent. Captain Miller and his mercenary squad were definitely reorganizing their forces. They knew their 2 forward scouts were down. They knew the prey they were hunting was armed and highly dangerous. The element of surprise was officially gone. Caden turned his attention to Jenkins. She leaned heavily against the cold, damp stone wall of the cave. She looked incredibly weak, and her skin was pale as chalk, but her brown eyes burned with an intense, unyielding determination. The shocking betrayal of her commanding officer did not break her spirit. It simply fueled her righteous anger. "The old abandoned ranger station is exactly 3 miles north of our current position," Jenkins said, her voice raspy and dry. "It sits at the very top of a steep, rocky ridge. It has a high-frequency emergency radio built into the command desk. We can use it to contact the FBI field office in Seattle directly. Miller cannot block that secure signal. He does not have the clearance or the necessary technology." "Can you walk 3 miles in this terrain?" Caden asked seriously. He checked the action on the captured Mk-18 combat rifle one more time, ensuring the chamber was clear of any dirt. "I do not have a choice in the matter," Jenkins replied flatly. She pushed herself forcefully off the stone wall. Her legs trembled violently under her own weight, but she managed to stand upright. She tightened the silver emergency blanket around her cold shoulders. "Brutus, point," Caden commanded softly. The large German shepherd moved immediately to the narrow cave entrance. He aggressively sniffed the damp mountain air, checking the perimeter for any fresh human scents. The heavy fog outside was slowly beginning to thin out, revealing the sharp, jagged gray peaks of the Cascade Mountains. They left the temporary safety of the hidden cave. The journey north was absolutely brutal. The mountain terrain grew steeper and much more treacherous with every single agonizing step. The freezing rain returned, turning the narrow dirt paths into slippery, dangerous mud chutes. Caden kept his strong left arm firmly wrapped around Jenkins' waist, supporting most of her body weight as they climbed. He carried the heavy combat rifle in his right hand, keeping his index finger resting safely just above the trigger guard. They moved in complete, disciplined silence for over 2 grueling hours. The physical toll on Jenkins was immense. Her breathing sounded ragged and wet in the cold air. Fresh, dark blood slowly seeped through her thick white bandages, but she absolutely refused to stop or complain. Caden deeply admired her sheer willpower. She possessed the undeniable heart of a true warrior. The dense pine forest suddenly opened up into a massive, rocky gorge. Towering walls of gray slate rose high on both sides, creating a natural, incredibly narrow funnel. It was a complete tactical nightmare for any infantry unit. "We have to cross the center of this ravine to reach the ridge trail," Jenkins whispered quietly, pointing a shaky finger straight across the deep, exposed gap. Caden studied the area intensely. He actively scanned the high ridges and the large boulders littering the gorge floor. He did not like this location at all. It was the perfect spot for a deadly ambush. "Stay close to the rock wall," he ordered in a low whisper. "Keep your head down and follow my exact footsteps." They stepped very carefully into the narrow gorge. The loose gravel crunched loudly beneath their heavy boots. The towering rock walls amplified every single small sound, making stealth nearly impossible. Brutus walked on point, keeping his wet nose close to the ground. Suddenly, the dog stopped dead in his tracks. He let out a vicious, guttural snarl from deep within his chest and lunged backward. "Get down!" Caden roared at the top of his lungs. He shoved Jenkins hard against the solid rock wall and threw his own heavy body directly over hers. The deafening, terrifying roar of automatic gunfire violently shattered the mountain silence. Heavy-caliber bullets struck the solid stone wall just inches above their heads. Sharp fragments of shattered rock rained down heavily on Caden's back. The mercenary ambush had finally arrived. Caden rolled quickly away from Jenkins and dropped flat onto his stomach in the dirt. He raised the captured MK-18 rifle and peered intensely through the holographic combat sight. He quickly spotted 3 heavily armed mercenaries positioned among the large boulders on the opposite side of the ravine. They wore urban camouflage uniforms and thick tactical vests. Caden controlled his breathing perfectly. He centered the glowing red reticle directly on the chest of the closest shooter. He squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession. 2 suppressed armor-piercing rounds hit the mercenary square in the center mass. The man collapsed violently backward over a gray boulder and did not move again. The remaining 2 shooters immediately shifted their aggressive, concentrated fire toward Caden's position. Bullets chewed up the gravel all around him, kicking up thick clouds of dust. He scrambled quickly behind a thick limestone pillar for cover. "Stay flat on the ground, Sarah," Caden yelled over the deafening noise of the gunfire. He popped out quickly from the right side of the pillar and fired a short, controlled burst of return fire. He forced the enemy shooters to keep their heads down behind their cover. He needed to advance and break their defensive line immediately, but the open ground between them was a complete death trap. Suddenly, a loud, incredibly sharp crack echoed from high above them on the ridge. A heavy sniper bullet smashed into the limestone pillar directly beside Caden's face. The massive kinetic impact showered his eyes with blinding white rock dust. Caden cursed loudly. A 4th shooter was positioned high up on the eastern ridge. It was a designated sniper wearing a thick camouflage hood to break up his silhouette. The enemy squad had perfectly established a deadly, inescapable crossfire. Caden desperately wiped the abrasive dust from his stinging eyes. He could not step out from cover to shoot the 2 men across the gorge. If he exposed his body for even a fraction of a second, the sniper above would instantly take his head off. He was completely pinned down in the crosshairs. The sniper fired again. The large bullet violently chipped the rough edge of Caden's rock cover. The highly trained shooter was systematically zeroing in on his exact position. The next shot would undoubtedly find its target. Brutus completely realized the immediate lethal danger to his master. The loyal dog did not wait for a tactical command. He acted purely on his fierce, unyielding, protective instincts. The massive German shepherd bolted suddenly from behind the rock wall. He completely ignored the heavy gunfire, tearing up the dirt ground all around his paws. He charged straight up the steep, rocky incline directly toward the hidden sniper's nest. He moved with terrifying, explosive, animalistic speed. The sniper saw the large dog charging aggressively up the hill. The man panicked completely. He shifted his heavy rifle hastily away from Caden and tried to track the incredibly fast animal. He fired one wild shot, but the dog was way too quick and agile. Brutus launched his muscular body forcefully through the air. He cleared the last large boulder and crashed directly into the sniper's chest. The heavy impact knocked the man violently flat on his back against the rocks. The sniper screamed in pure, unadulterated terror as Brutus sank his sharp teeth incredibly deep into the man's right forearm. The heavy sniper rifle fell clattering down the steep cliff face. The dog shook his head violently, brutally tearing at the thick combat fabric and the flesh beneath it. The bleeding sniper desperately reached for a tactical combat knife strapped to his chest rig. Caden immediately stepped out from behind the limestone pillar. He raised his Mk-18 rifle, quickly tracking the two men across the gorge who were completely distracted by their screaming sniper. Caden fired with absolute, lethal precision. He neutralized both immediate threats with clean shots in less than 3 seconds. He immediately turned his weapon toward the high ridge. "Brutus, release!" Caden shouted loudly. The highly trained dog let go of the bloody arm instantly and backed away, barking aggressively at the fallen man. The severely wounded sniper tried to sit up, frantically clutching his torn arm. He looked directly down the dark barrel of Caden's rifle. The man froze completely in terror, dropping his combat knife onto the cold rocks. Caden kept the rifle aimed perfectly at the man's head. The violent ravine suddenly fell dead silent again, save for the low, highly threatening growls of the dog. "Secure him," Caden ordered the dog. Brutus stood directly over the wounded man, baring his bloody teeth. Caden rushed quickly back to Jenkins. She was badly shaken, but entirely unhurt by the deadly crossfire. "Are you okay?" he asked quickly. "I am fine." Jenkins nodded slowly. She looked up at the ridge in absolute awe. "Your dog just saved our lives." "He always does," Caden said proudly. He helped her carefully back to her feet. "The old ranger station is just over that ridge. We need to move immediately before Captain Miller realizes his entire ambush squad is completely gone." The hike over the final rocky ridge took another painful hour. The freezing rain finally stopped entirely, leaving the mountain air crisp and bone-chilling. The thick fog slowly dissipated in the pre-dawn gloom, revealing a dark purple sky. Caden supported almost all of Jenkins' body weight now. The wounded deputy was running entirely on pure adrenaline and sheer willpower. Her breathing was dangerously shallow, and her skin felt cold as ice. "There," Jenkins whispered. She raised a shaking, muddy hand. Caden looked through the dark pine trees. A large, sturdy wooden cabin sat nestled near the edge of a steep cliff. It was the abandoned ranger station. Faint yellow light spilled from the dirty front windows. A small gasoline generator hummed quietly near the back door. "Someone is already inside," Caden stated in a low whisper. He lowered Jenkins gently behind a massive fallen pine log. He checked his captured Mk-18 rifle. He had half a magazine left. "Miller," Jenkins breathed out. Her pale face twisted with a mix of deep physical pain and profound anger. He must have flown in by helicopter and hiked up the back trail. "Stay here with Brutus," Caden ordered strictly. "No," Jenkins grabbed his wrist firmly. "He is my captain. He betrayed my badge. This is my personal fight. I am going in there with you." Caden looked into her determined brown eyes. He understood completely. This was deeply personal for her. He respected her courage immensely. He nodded slowly. "Stay exactly behind me. Do not move unless I tell you." Caden took the lead. He moved silently through the wet brush, keeping his profile low. They approached the front porch of the cabin. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar. Caden signaled for Brutus to wait near the wooden steps. The large dog sat down in the mud instantly, remaining perfectly still and quiet in the shadows. Caden peeked through the narrow gap in the doorframe. The interior of the cabin was a large single room. Dusty topographical maps covered the wooden walls. A heavy metal desk sat exactly in the center. An older man in a dark green tactical jacket stood near the desk. He had short gray hair and a thick, rough face. He held a drawn 9mm pistol in his right hand. This was Captain Miller. A second man stood near the corner window. He wore a sharp black suit that looked completely out of place in the wild mountains. He held a compact submachine gun resting against his hip. This was the cartel boss. "They failed," Miller barked angrily into a handheld radio. "My entire squad is gone. You hired a bunch of useless mercenaries." "Your mess, Captain," the cartel boss replied smoothly. His voice carried a thick, heavy accent. "You promised a very clean operation. You promised the girl would disappear quietly." "She will," Miller snapped back. He turned toward the heavy metal desk. "She has to come here to use the high-frequency radio. It is her only way out of these mountains. We wait for her." Caden did not wait. Waiting surrendered the tactical initiative completely. He raised his heavy combat boot and kicked the wooden door completely open. The loud crash echoed violently inside the small cabin. Caden stepped smoothly into the room. He raised the Mk-18 rifle and aimed it directly at Captain Miller's chest. Jenkins stepped into the doorway right behind him. She leaned heavily against the wooden doorframe, clutching her bleeding shoulder tightly. Miller froze completely. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he stared at his wounded deputy and the heavily armed stranger standing next to her. The cartel boss instinctively raised his submachine gun. "Drop the weapons right now," Caden commanded. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. It was a cold, hard, military order. Miller stared intensely at Jenkins. He slowly lowered his pistol slightly, but he did not drop it. "Sarah," he said smoothly, trying to sound completely calm and in control. "You look terrible, kid." "You sold me out," Jenkins stated clearly. Her voice trembled with raw, unadulterated fury. 10 years I worked for you. I looked up to you as a mentor." "It is just business, Sarah," Miller replied coldly. He took a slow, calculated step sideways. "The department budget is a total joke. The pension is a joke. These people offered me $3 million to ensure their supply routes stayed completely clear. You just had to stick your nose where it did not belong. You are a total disgrace to that badge," Jenkins spat out. "And you are dead," Miller snarled viciously. He raised his pistol aggressively. Caden anticipated the sudden, violent movement perfectly. He did not fire his rifle. Firing a weapon inside the small wooden cabin would deafen them all and cause chaotic, unpredictable ricochets. He needed complete, absolute control of the entire environment. Caden spotted a large, gray metal electrical fuse box mounted on the wooden wall directly behind the cartel boss. The thick power cables ran straight to the noisy generator outside. Caden reached down to his tactical belt in one lightning-fast fluid motion. He grabbed a heavy steel flashlight. He threw it violently across the room with all his raw physical strength. The heavy metal cylinder smashed directly into the plastic fuse box. The cover shattered completely. Bright blue sparks exploded violently from the broken wires. The yellow overhead lights instantly popped and died. The cabin plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. Caden moved instantly. He relied entirely on his rigorous combat training. He knew the exact layout of the room from his brief visual scan. He dropped the heavy rifle to its tactical sling and drew his cold steel combat knife. He closed the distance to the cartel boss in 2 silent, explosive strides. The man in the suit fired his submachine gun blindly into the dark. The bright muzzle flashes illuminated the room for a fraction of a second. It was all Caden needed. He ducked smoothly under the wild stream of bullets. He drove his heavy combat boot brutally into the man's knee. The bone snapped with a sickening crunch. The man screamed loudly and collapsed. Caden struck him hard behind the neck with the heavy pommel of his knife, knocking him completely unconscious against the floorboards. Miller fired his pistol wildly toward the sound of the violent scuffle. A bullet tore cleanly through the sleeve of Caden's tactical shirt, burning his skin lightly. Caden dropped extremely low to the wooden floor. He swept his right leg forcefully, in a wide, fast arc. His heavy boot connected solidly with Miller's ankles. The corrupt police captain fell hard onto his back. His pistol skittered away across the dusty floor. Caden lunged forward like a predator. He pinned Miller completely to the ground with his heavy knee. He grabbed the older man firmly by the collar of his tactical jacket and drove a brutal, punishing right hook directly into his jaw. Miller's head snapped back, and he went completely limp. The violent fight lasted exactly 12 seconds. Caden stood up slowly in the pitch-black cabin. He breathed heavily. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his secondary backup flashlight. He clicked it on. The bright white beam swept across the room. Both men lay completely motionless on the floor. "Sarah?" Caden called out softly into the quiet room. "I am here," Jenkins replied weakly from the doorway. She slid slowly down the doorframe until she sat heavily on the floor. She looked completely exhausted, but she managed a small, victorious smile. Caden walked confidently over to the heavy metal desk. He shined his light directly on the large, old-fashioned high-frequency radio. The main power was cut, but it featured a military-grade emergency battery backup system. He flipped the heavy red switch. The radio dials immediately glowed with a faint, comforting green light. The battle was finally over. He picked up the heavy microphone. Caden held the heavy black microphone of the high-frequency radio. He pressed the transmit button firmly. The device hummed with raw power. He tuned the dial to the emergency frequency utilized by federal agencies across the Pacific Northwest. He did not bother calling local dispatch. The local department was completely compromised. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Seattle Field Office. This is Chief Petty Officer Caden, United States Navy. I am declaring a Priority 1 emergency at the abandoned Northridge Ranger Station in the Cascade Mountains. I have a critically wounded deputy sheriff and 2 hostile prisoners secured. One prisoner is a corrupt local police captain. The other is an active cartel operative. We need immediate medical evacuation and a federal tactical team. Static hissed through the speaker for several tense seconds. Then, a sharp and professional voice broke through the white noise. "Copy your transmission, Chief Petty Officer. This is FBI dispatch. We are tracking your radio signal now. Authenticate your military ID." Caden recited his service number calmly. A brief pause followed. "Identity confirmed, Chief. We are scrambling a hostage rescue team and a medical chopper from the nearest airbase. Estimated time of arrival is 45 minutes. Secure the perimeter and hold your position." "Understood," Caden replied. He placed the microphone back onto the metal receiver. He turned off the radio to preserve the emergency battery. He grabbed his flashlight and walked over to the 2 unconscious men on the floor. He pulled a handful of heavy-duty plastic zip ties from his tactical vest. He flipped the cartel boss onto his stomach and bound his wrists tightly behind his back. He did the exact same thing to Captain Miller. The corrupt police veteran groaned loudly as the plastic bit into his wrists. He was slowly waking up from the heavy blow to his jaw. Caden stood up and walked over to Deputy Sarah Jenkins. She sat slumped against the wooden door frame. Her breathing was terribly shallow. Her face looked completely drained of blood. Brutus sat right next to her, resting his large, warm head gently on her uninjured leg. "Federal tactical team is on the way," Caden told her quietly. "A medical helicopter is coming for you. Just hold on a little longer." Jenkins nodded weakly. She looked across the dark room at Captain Miller. The older man blinked his eyes, trying to clear his blurry vision. He looked up at Caden, then at Jenkins. Realization washed over his rough face. He had lost everything. "Help me stand up," Jenkins whispered. She reached out her good right hand toward Caden. Caden frowned slightly. "You need to rest, Sarah. You have lost too much blood." "Help me stand," she repeated. Her voice held absolute steel. Caden grabbed her hand and pulled her gently to her feet. She swayed heavily, leaning her entire left side against Caden's chest. She reached down to her tactical belt with trembling fingers. She unclipped her heavy steel police handcuffs. She walked slowly across the dusty floor. Every single step looked agonizing. Caden walked right beside her, supporting her weight. She stopped directly in front of Captain Miller. Miller looked up at her from the floor. He did not say a word. He looked utterly defeated. Jenkins knelt down painfully. She grabbed Miller's tied hands. She clamped the heavy steel handcuffs securely over his wrists, right above the plastic zip ties. The metal clicked loudly, locking firmly into place. "Captain Miller," Jenkins said. Her voice was raspy, but perfectly clear. "You are under arrest for attempted murder, corruption, and treason against your badge. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." She let go of his hands and stood back up. She leaned heavily against Caden. The adrenaline finally left her body completely. Her knees buckled. Caden caught her before she hit the floor. He picked her up carefully and carried her over to a dusty cot in the corner of the room. He laid her down and covered her with his thick tactical jacket and the silver emergency blanket. "You did good, Deputy," Caden whispered. He checked her bandages one final time. The bleeding had finally stopped. "Thank you," she breathed out. Her eyes slowly drifted shut. "Thank you for not leaving me in the woods." "I never leave people behind," Caden replied softly. The next 40 minutes passed in complete silence. Caden stood guard at the front door. He held the captured MK-18 combat rifle ready, watching the dark tree line for any remaining threats. Brutus stayed right beside the cot, guarding the sleeping officer. Slowly, the pitch-black sky began to turn a deep shade of purple. The heavy fog completely lifted from the valley. A faint orange glow appeared on the eastern horizon. Dawn was finally breaking over the rugged Cascade Mountains. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the pine trees, illuminating the small wooden cabin. Then Caden heard it. The deep, rhythmic thumping of heavy helicopter rotor blades echoed through the mountain air. The sound grew louder and more intense by the second. A massive, black tactical helicopter crested the high ridge. It hovered directly over the small clearing outside the cabin, kicking up a massive cloud of dirt and pine needles. Caden stepped out onto the wooden porch. He raised his left hand, signaling the pilot. The helicopter landed swiftly. The side doors slid open instantly. 6 heavily armed FBI tactical agents swarmed out of the chopper, weapons raised. They secured the perimeter in seconds. 2 federal combat medics rushed directly toward the cabin, carrying heavy trauma bags and a folding stretcher. Caden stepped aside to let them pass. The medics rushed inside and immediately began working on Jenkins. They checked her vitals, started a blood transfusion line, and secured her carefully onto the stretcher. An FBI tactical team leader walked up the wooden steps. He looked at Caden, taking in the blood-stained tactical shirt, the captured weapons, and the large German shepherd standing quietly by his side. "Are you Chief Petty Officer Caden?" the agent asked formally. "Yes," Caden replied. He handed the heavy MK-18 rifle over to the federal agent. "The 2 prisoners are inside, bound and cuffed. The short one needs a doctor for a broken knee." The medics carried Jenkins out of the cabin on the stretcher. They moved quickly toward the waiting helicopter. As they passed Caden, Jenkins opened her eyes. She reached out her hand weakly. Caden stepped forward and gently took her hand. "Will I ever see you again?" she asked softly over the loud roar of the helicopter engines. Caden offered a rare, genuine smile. "I usually prefer the beach for my vacations, but maybe I will come back to the mountains someday. Keep that badge clean, Sarah." Jenkins smiled back. The medics loaded her into the helicopter. The FBI agents dragged the 2 prisoners out of the cabin and pushed them toward the chopper. The team leader turned to Caden. "We need you to come with us, Chief. We have a lot of paperwork to fill out, and a massive debriefing waiting for you in Seattle." Caden looked at the loud helicopter. He looked at the federal agents. Then he looked at the quiet, sunlit forest surrounding them. The air smelled fresh and clean again. "I am currently on authorized leave," Caden stated calmly. "I still have exactly 4 days left of my vacation. You have my name and my unit. Your superiors know exactly how to find my command. Tell them I will file a full operational report when I return to base." The agent looked surprised, but he recognized the firm, uncompromising tone of a Navy SEAL. He nodded slowly. "Understood, Chief. Enjoy the rest of your leave." Caden turned away from the noise and the chaos. He adjusted his heavy backpack. He looked down at his loyal dog. "Come on, Brutus," Caden said quietly. "Let's go find a quiet place to camp." Brutus wagged his tail happily. The man and his dog walked away from the ranger station. They stepped back into the wild, beautiful forest, disappearing completely into the morning light. The story of Caden, Brutus, and Deputy Jenkins proves that true heroes are not always defined by their titles, but by their willingness to do what is right when no one else is watching. In a world where betrayal and darkness can strike at any moment, unwavering honor and true loyalty will always light the way. As the narrator, this story moves me deeply because it reminds us that even in our most desperate hours, a stranger's brave heart and a loyal dog's fierce protection can completely change our fate. May God bless you and your loved ones with endless safety, strength, and courage. Please type Amen in the comments if you believe in the power of true heroes and divine protection. If this story inspired you, please gently share this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true-to-life stories.